The grand revolving doors of Celestine Grand Hotel slid open, allowing a rush of cool, air-conditioned air to swirl around Rafael D'Cruz as he stepped inside. The hotel's polished marble floors gleamed under the golden chandeliers, reflecting an opulence that mirrored his own. The soft murmur of distant conversations, the delicate clinking of crystal glasses, and the scent of fresh-cut roses blended seamlessly into the background, a world he had long grown accustomed to. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored midnight blue suit, his sharp eyes scanning the lobby out of habit rather than necessity. He was a man who thrived on control, of his business, of his surroundings, of himself. At 35, he had carved out a kingdom in the world of wine exports, turning D'Cruz Vintners into an empire that stretched across continents. Yet, tonight, something was different. The feeling hit him the moment he stepped into his penthouse suite. A faint disturbance in the air. An unfamiliar shift in the room's energy. Rafael's gaze flicked across the space, taking in the dim lighting, the sleek leather couch, the untouched tray of imported whiskey on the bar. Everything was in its place, just as he had left it. And yet, something felt off. Then he saw it. His bed. A figure was curled on top of the king-sized mattress, nestled into the silk sheets as if she belonged there. For a split second, Rafael didn't move, his mind struggling to register the sheer audacity of what he was seeing. A stranger, a woman, her small frame barely disturbing the pristine bedspread, her dark hair fanned out across the pillow like ink spilled on porcelain. His initial reaction was a flicker of disbelief. Then, irritation. Who the hell was she, and what was she doing in his bed? His jaw tightened. Moving with quiet, controlled precision, he stepped closer. The faint glow from the city skyline illuminated her face, soft features, golden brown skin, full lips slightly parted in deep sleep. Her uniform, a maid's uniform, was unmistakable. His irritation sharpened into something colder. How dare she? Rafael had spent years ensuring that nothing in his life was out of order. He demanded precision, discipline. And yet, here she was, sleeping, in his space, as if she had every right to be there. Enough. With a quiet but commanding voice, he said, "Wake up." No reaction. His patience, already razor-thin after a night of high-stakes negotiations, snapped. He stepped closer, towering over her, and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "I said, wake up." The effect was instant. The woman jerked awake with a sharp gasp, her breath catching as she bolted upright. Confusion flickered across her face before it morphed into something far more potent, fear. Her wide, honey-brown eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, Rafael saw it all: panic, exhaustion, the devastating realization of who he was and what she had just done. She knew she was in trouble. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, heavy, as if the world itself had narrowed down to just this one impossible moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. I didn't mean to," she stammered, scrambling to sit up properly. I was just cleaning, and I sat down for a second and, I didn't mean to fall asleep, I swear." She was trembling. Rafael watched her, his expression unreadable. He had expected anger, perhaps even defiance. But what he saw instead was something unexpected. Genuine fear. His eyes flicked down to her hands, shaking as she clutched at the hem of her uniform. She wasn't just afraid of losing her job. She was terrified of him. And for some reason, that made him pause. He didn't move, didn't say anything. Instead, he simply watched her, studying the way she struggled to find her words, the way her breath hitched as she waited for his judgment. What a strange night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Rafael exhaled, slow and measured. His next words came out low, edged with quiet curiosity. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, Seraphina. And just like that, Rafael knew, this wasn't over. Seraphina Vale's hands trembled as she clutched the handle of her cleaning cart, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She had barely made it out of Rafael D'Cruz's penthouse suite alive, or at least, that's what it felt like. She had fallen asleep in his bed. The realization alone sent a fresh wave of humiliation crashing over her. She had heard the whispers about him, the ruthless billionaire, the man who built an empire out of nothing, who had no patience for incompetence. And she had been careless enough to collapse in exhaustion in his private suite? If he had reported her, she would have been fired on the spot. But he didn't. Instead, he had asked for her name. And now, days later, he kept calling for her. Not just once. Not twice. But every night. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. He needed extra towels. Fresh fruit. A special tea blend. Simple things that any housekeeper could have delivered. But each time, the front desk had sent her. And each time, she found Rafael D'Cruz waiting. His dark, assessing eyes held something unreadable, something that made her stomach twist with unease. It wasn't quite anger. Not quite amusement. But it was something. Tonight was no different. Seraphina stood outside the penthouse door, balancing a silver tray of grilled salmon, steamed vegetables, and a bottle of imported red wine. The scent was rich, intoxicating, but nothing compared to the way her heart pounded at the thought of stepping inside. She inhaled sharply and knocked. A deep, familiar voice responded almost immediately. "Come in." She swallowed and pushed the door open. Rafael D'Cruz sat at the dining table, his jacket discarded, the sleeves of his crisp navy blue dress shirt rolled up. His forearms, strong and veined, rested lazily against the table as he swirled a glass of wine in one hand. He didn't look up immediately. Only when she set the tray down, careful not to make a sound, did he finally speak. "You've been avoiding me." Seraphina's fingers curled around the tray's edges. "Not this again." She straightened her spine, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I've been working, sir." A slow smirk touched his lips, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lying doesn't suit you." She swallowed, struggling to steady her breathing. He was too direct. Too sharp. Too dangerous. "Sit." Her stomach clenched. "Sir." He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Seraphina hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. No. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. I shouldn't," she whispered, gripping the tray tighter. "I'm just here to deliver your meal." His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. Something that made her breath catch. He set his wine glass down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You think I'm going to report you?" Seraphina flinched. Of course she did. She should have been fired already. "You should," she admitted, barely above a whisper. "I fell asleep in your bed." That was unprofessional. It was disrespectful to your space. For a moment, he simply studied her. Then, to her utter shock, he laughed. Not cruelly. Not mockingly. Just a deep, quiet chuckle, as if she had said something absurd. "Unprofessional, yes," he murmured, "but disrespectful?" "No." Her eyes widened. "But you didn't steal from me. You didn't break anything. You just slept." He tilted his head, his gaze razor-sharp. "And honestly? You looked comfortable." Heat burned up her neck. Comfortable? This had to be some kind of game. Some power play she didn't understand. She took a sharp step back. "Sir, please. I'm not going to fire you, Seraphina." The way he said her name, like it meant something, made her chest tighten. I don't understand, she admitted, voice unsteady. Why are you telling me this? There was a long silence. Then, his voice softened, just slightly. Because I see something in you. Her breath caught. Something wasted in this place. Seraphina didn't know what to say, didn't know how to breathe under the weight of his stare. Then, Rafael leaned back, fingers tapping once against the table. Come work for me. Her world stopped. She blinked, heart racing. What? His expression was unreadable. You heard me. Be my personal assistant. Seraphina's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Was this some kind of joke? Some cruel test? I don't know anything about business, she stammered. I clean rooms. I don't belong in your world. His lips curled into something almost amused. Then I'll teach you. Seraphina shook her head furiously. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. I don't understand. Her voice was hoarse. Why would you offer me this? Rafael's dark eyes locked onto hers. And this time, there was no amusement. No mystery. Just raw, unshakable certainty. Because I don't make mistakes, Seraphina. His voice was quiet. Steady. And I never choose wrong. Seraphina had never belonged in Rafael D'Cruz's world. She was a girl who had spent her life scrubbing floors, changing linens, and disappearing into the background. A girl who had learned that blending in was safer than being seen. But Rafael saw her. And that terrified her more than anything. The first few weeks as his personal assistant had been overwhelming. The office at D'Cruz Vintners was nothing like the quiet halls of the Celestine Grand Hotel. Here, power moved like an undercurrent, subtle, silent, but undeniable. Deals were made in hushed conversations behind glass walls, fortunes were decided over a single handshake, and Rafael, he was at the center of it all, unshaken, unreadable, a force of nature wrapped in tailored suits and quiet dominance. Seraphina tried to keep her distance, to pretend he was just her boss, but he didn't make it easy. Every time she entered his office, his dark eyes followed her, watching. Every time their hands accidentally brushed, heat seared through her veins. And worst of all, he noticed everything. You keep running from me, Seraphina. The words cut through the silence one evening as she finished filing reports in his office. Her fingers froze on the paper. Slowly, she turned, meeting his gaze. I'm not running. Rafael leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but something dark flickered behind his eyes. A lie. Her heart pounded. I'm just doing my job. He stood then, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in. The space between them shrank until he was close, too close. You don't look at me the way my employees do. His voice was low, smooth, dangerously calm. You flinch when I stand near you, and yet you linger when you think I'm not watching. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering against her ribs. You're imagining things. His lips curved, but there was no amusement in it. Am I? Seraphina clenched her fists, willing herself to breathe. I work for you. That's all this is. No, it's not. The certainty in his voice made something inside her crack. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent years staying invisible, avoiding men like him, men who could take one look at a girl like her and destroy her without even trying. But Rafael was different. He wasn't trying to ruin her, he was trying to understand her. And that was far, far worse. The air between them was thick, suffocating. Then, his voice dropped, softer this time. Tell me the truth, Seraphina. Why are you afraid? Her breath hitched. Because he made her feel things she had no right to feel. Because he looked at her like she was something more than a girl who had spent her life in the shadows. Because every time he got close, she forgot how to breathe. But she couldn't say that. So instead, she did the only thing she knew how to do, she ran. She turned quickly, grabbing the files and muttering something about work, about being busy, about anything that would get her out of that room before she did something reckless. But just as she reached the door, his voice stopped her cold. "You can run, Seraphina," he murmured, "but we both know you'll come back." Her fingers trembled on the doorknob. And the worst part? He was right. Seraphina was beginning to understand something dangerous. It wasn't just that Rafael D'Cruz was magnetic, that he commanded a room without trying. It wasn't just that his voice, smooth, deep, edged with authority, sent a shiver down her spine when he spoke her name. No, the real danger was that she could no longer tell where the lines were. For weeks, she had told herself she was simply his assistant. That the long hours in his office, the quiet dinners he insisted she stay for, the way his gaze lingered on her across boardrooms, none of it meant anything. But tonight, as she stood in his penthouse, clearing the remnants of his dinner, she knew she had been lying to herself. The air was thick, charged, humming with an unspoken truth neither of them dared to acknowledge. She could feel his presence before she even turned. Rafael leaned against the counter, watching her, the dim city lights painting shadows across his face. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, exposing the strong, veined forearms she had seen grip a crystal glass with the same precision he used to control entire empires. Except now, his control was slipping. "You keep avoiding me, Seraphina." Her hands stilled. She forced a neutral expression, busying herself with stacking the plates. "I don't know what you mean." Rafael let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Don't insult me." Her pulse spiked. "Don't react. Don't look at him. Don't. Look at me." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned. And the moment she did, she regretted it. His dark eyes pinned her in place, unreadable yet searing, like a force she couldn't fight. He took a slow step forward. "Tell me something, Sarah." His voice was softer now, almost thoughtful, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "Why do you run every time I get too close?" She exhaled shakily. "I don't run." Another step. "No?" He tilted his head, as if considering her, his fingers lightly drumming against the counter. "Then why is your heart racing?" She felt it, wild, erratic, betraying her. Seraphina gripped the cloth in her hands tighter. "Because you're making me uncomfortable." His lips twitched. "Lie." Heat rushed to her face. Rafael D'Cruz was too many things, ruthless, brilliant, relentless, but above all else, he was perceptive. He saw through people the way most men read newspapers. And right now, he was reading her like an open book. She should have left. She should have turned around, walked out of that penthouse, and ended whatever this was before it started. But she didn't move. And neither did he. "You confuse me," she admitted, barely above a whisper. That made him pause. For a man who always knew his next move, the admission seemed to throw him for a fraction of a second. Then, his expression shifted, darker, deeper. "Good." The air between them felt suffocating now, heavy with something she didn't want to name. Rafael reached out, achingly slow, as if giving her time to stop him. But she didn't. His fingers brushed against a stray strand of hair that had fallen over her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. His touch burned. "I confuse you," he echoed, voice lower now. "Or you just don't want to admit the truth?" Her breath hitched. "Which is?" Rafael's lips barely moved, but his answer sent fire through her veins. "That you don't want to run." Silence crashed between them, deafening. She should say something. Anything. But the truth, the undeniable, terrifying truth, was that she had nothing to say. Because he was right. Seraphina could still hear the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass walls of Rafael's penthouse. The distant echoes of honking cars, muffled conversations from the streets below, the occasional gust of wind against the balcony railing. Yet, all of it felt distant, like background noise in a dream, because nothing in the world felt more real than the man standing in front of her. "Marry me." The words landed like a shockwave. Seraphina's breath hitched, her pulse stuttering. She stared at him, searching for some flicker of jest in his sharp, unreadable expression. But Rafael D'Cruz wasn't a man who played games. His words were always deliberate, precise. He meant it. A slow, nervous laugh bubbled up from her throat. "Rafael, that's insane." He didn't flinch, didn't move. His dark, piercing gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Why?" Seraphina took a step back, needing space, needing air, but Rafael closed the distance instantly, as if he refused to let her slip away. "Why?" he repeated, his voice low but edged with something dangerous. She shook her head, forcing herself to breathe. "You know why. Look at you, Rafael. You live in a world of power, of influence, of men in tailored suits who shape the economy with a single handshake. And me? I spent years scrubbing floors, blending into the background. Do you really think this, us, makes sense?" A flicker of something flashed in his gaze. Anger? Frustration? Or something deeper, something rawer? "I don't give a damn about sense, Seraphina." His voice was steady, unwavering. "I care about you." The weight of those words pressed into her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She felt unsteady, as if standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that one wrong step would send her spiraling into something she could never escape. "This isn't just about you caring, Rafael. This is about reality. About the people who will talk, who will judge. You think they'll accept this? That your world will accept me?" His jaw tightened, and for the first time, frustration bled into his tone. "To hell with them." Seraphina exhaled sharply. "You can say that because you were born into this world. But I wasn't." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. She could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, feel the tremor in her hands as she clenched them at her sides. And then, just when she thought he would argue, Rafael exhaled, slow and deliberate. His gaze softened. "You think I don't know that?" he murmured. Seraphina blinked, caught off guard. "You think I don't see the way you hesitate when you walk into a room full of executives? The way you keep your head down, as if you're still the girl cleaning hotel rooms instead of the woman who now runs entire projects for my company?" Her breath caught. "You're not invisible anymore, Seraphina." He stepped closer, so close that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, his presence wrapping around her like something undeniable. "Not to me. And not to the world." Her eyes burned, and she hated it, hated how much he affected her, how much his words mattered. Rafael tilted his head slightly, studying her with that unreadable expression that made her feel like he saw right through her. "You want to know why I want to marry you?" She swallowed hard. "Because I don't believe in wasting time. I know what I want, Seraphina. And I want you." Her chest tightened. "Rafael. I've built empires, secured billion-dollar deals, crushed competitors without a second thought. But do you know the only thing that has ever truly unsettled me?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "You." Seraphina's breath trembled. "Every time you walk into a room, I feel it. Every time you argue with me, challenge me, push me to be better, I feel it. And when you're not near me, it drives me insane. So no, this isn't about logic, or society, or what the world expects." He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, and despite every instinct telling her to pull away, she didn't. This is about the fact that I have never wanted anything the way I want you. And I'm not letting you walk away from this. A deep ache bloomed in her chest, a war raging inside her between fear and something far more dangerous, hope. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to trust that this wasn't some fleeting whim, that she wasn't just a novelty in his world of polished excess and ruthless ambition. But trusting meant risking. And risking meant falling. Rafael, as if sensing her hesitation, lifted her hand to his lips, his voice quieter now, softer. Say yes. Her entire world tilted. Seraphina could feel the answer resting on her tongue, heavy and terrifying. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. She had been falling for him from the very beginning. And there was no turning back. Slowly, shakily, she whispered the word that changed everything. Yes. The moment the word left her lips, Rafael smiled. And just like that, her fate was sealed. The whispers never stopped. They followed Seraphina like shadows, clinging to every step she took, curling around every glance thrown her way. In the beginning, it had been unbearable, the way people stared, the way they talked, as if her existence in Rafael D'Cruz's world was an insult to the very fabric of power and privilege. A maid, they sneered. A nobody. She had heard it all. The murmurs in the boardrooms, the scandalized gasps at elegant social gatherings. The way women in silk gowns and diamond necklaces sneered as she walked past. At first, she had let it get to her. At first, she had been afraid. But fear had no place beside a man like Rafael. Not when he looked at her like she was his equal. Not when he held her hand at every event, daring the world to challenge him. Not when his grip tightened whenever someone whispered something cruel, his dark gaze silencing entire rooms without a single word. She had fought to belong. She had fought to prove she was more than just a maid who had fallen into a billionaire's life. And she had won. Now, standing on the balcony of their home, no, their empire, overlooking the glittering skyline of the city, she finally felt it. Peace. Do you regret it? His voice was quiet, but it was laced with something deeper, something rare. Vulnerability. Seraphina turned to him, finding his sharp, chiseled features softened under the golden glow of the city lights. He looked like he belonged to another world, a world of wealth and power, of control and dominance. And yet, here he was. Hers. Regret? She echoed, tilting her head. Rafael, do you think I regret you? His jaw tightened slightly, his fingers drumming against the balcony railing. The great Rafael D'Cruz was nervous. Seraphina's lips curled. How absurd. She reached out, gently intertwining her fingers with his, bringing his hand to rest against her chest, right where her heart pounded. This, she whispered. This is what you've done to me. You took a girl no one saw, no one believed in, and you made her believe she was more. That she could be more. His throat worked, but he said nothing. Seraphina exhaled, pressing her forehead against his, closing her eyes. You think I regret choosing you? She smiled softly, shaking her head. I regret nothing, Rafael. Not the whispers. Not the fight. Not the sleepless nights wondering if I was good enough. She pulled back, her gaze fierce. Because I am. His eyes darkened, something powerful flashing through them before his grip on her tightened. You were always enough. His voice was low, reverent. Dangerous. Seraphina barely had time to take a breath before he pulled her against him, his lips crashing onto hers in a way that left her breathless, in a way that silenced the last of her doubts. It was a kiss that spoke of ownership, of devotion, of an unbreakable claim. When they finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers, his breathing uneven. You ruined me, Seraphina. She smiled, her fingers tracing the sharp lines of his jaw. Good. Below them, the city continued to hum with life, unaware that the most powerful man in it had just surrendered, not to the world, not to society, but to the woman who had stolen his heart. And as he pulled her into his arms once more, whispering promises against her skin, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world had tried to break them. The world had tried to rip them apart. And yet, here they stood. Together. Unshaken. Unbreakable. And that was the greatest victory of all. Love isn't always about perfection, it's about the fight, the fire, and the choice to stand together against all odds. Seraphina and Rafael's story proves that love isn't defined by status but by resilience and trust. Speech balloon, what do you think? Do you believe love can defy the barriers of wealth and class? Red heart like if you enjoyed this journey. Loudspeaker comment your favorite moment. Bell subscribe for more gripping stories filled with passion, power, and heart-stopping romance. Because sometimes, love chooses the most unexpected people. Sparkles ring fire.